right, good morning, everyone. So since we have two presentations, I'll go first. Justin will go next, and then maybe we'll hold questions till the end, if everyone's okay with that. So with that, we'll get started. So as mentioned, I'm Pat McLoughlin. I'm the State Chief Data Officer for the state of Maryland. We've had some great presentations so far talking about, AI and different technologies that are being leveraged. I think our presentations are going to take a step back a bit and talk about the general governance of the data we want to use, and some of the practices that we're putting in place at different levels of government, whether it be at state or city. So I'll get started here. First thing I want to start with, there's a lot of text on this, so you don't have to read all of this by any means. But my position within the state was created by executive order, and essentially it granted a number of responsibilities that my position and our office need to carry out throughout all of the executive branch agencies across the state. And it gives us different concepts around, facilitating and coordinating shared data and putting together governance structures and really providing a lot of advice and guidance to agencies. So what we've done is taken that series of information and distilled that down to more broadly a couple of kind of practices that we want to ensure that we're carrying out. And those include generally setting guidelines and frameworks of data governance across the state. We want to really focus on standardization and integration of data systems, promoting data sharing, enabling data use. And the key thing I'm going to talk about today is with what we're doing in the state is it's not a command and control approach. So when we're dealing with any government entity, you've got a number of agencies or departments that tend to have their own domain expertise and responsibilities. They've been doing things for a long time. To come in and try to change everything, to say we're going to do a one-size-fits-all approach to this, and your business practices are no longer under consideration, that's never going to work. So what we need to do is build out more of a coalition around what are the guidelines and principles we can all align with, and then make sure that their business strategies are aligned with those principles. So I mentioned dealing with the different agencies, at least within the state. Here's just a list of the executive branch agencies that we're responsible for. So we've got a lot of variation in size, overall focus, their missions, funding. So we need to make sure that we're accounting for those disparities or those differentiating factors when we're pulling together some frameworks. So we're going to give you a little bit of background of where we are today, or kind of when things started, and then focus on some of the steps we've taken over the course of the last few months to start to enact a broader governance structure throughout the state. So my position started in November, so I'm just about 6 months into the role. I am the first ever state chief data officer, so it's a new position. That means that we have the opportunity to set a great standard. We also have the opportunity to make a tremendous amount of mistakes, and hopefully whoever comes after me in the future at some point, hopefully it's not for some time, but they can learn from the mistakes that we make. So I want to look quickly at what our current landscape is across the state. So we are in a position where we've got loads of agencies who have historically been responsible for their own enterprise of information, whether that's their technology stack, whether that's the data that's itself, their business practices, their governance structure. And they vary quite significantly when it comes to maturity levels. Some have really robust programs that have been in place for some time. When I'm talking about programs, data management, data governance programs. They've got solid documentation, they put the resources in place, they're incredibly mature and literate in their approach to how they want to manage their data and what they want to get out of it. They've already built in some data science teams, and they're working with more advanced technologies. Then there are others, like you'll see in the lower right-hand corner here, I've got agencies. So we have our Department of Information Technology, which serves as kind of the enterprise administrator. However, not all the agencies are in the enterprise itself. So this is where we get into a situation where we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. Because we've got these different kind of varying levels of experience, and maturity, and you'll see the example in the middle is just the person who has a bunch of spreadsheets and a lot of hard copy paper that they're still working with and don't know what to do with that. So kind of how do we corral all of this? How do we get to a position where we can effectively develop a strategy for each of these agencies that are all aligned together, but do so in a way that they can kind of be successful, and they can set a roadmap that allows them to achieve success over time without the expectation of it's got to be done tomorrow when they know they don't have the resources, they don't have the funding to do it right away. So with our current landscape in mind, and knowing that this is the model that we've been operating under for some time, and before I jump to the next slide, I should say this. When I talk about having some levels of maturity that are rather high and robust, we do have a number of really significant and successful centralized programs. Our open data program across the state is fantastic. That's actually run exclusively between the Department of Information Technology with support of the Governor's Office of Performance Improvement. That does, in fact, take data from all of these different agencies, centralize, consolidate, and deliver from a single portal. In our case, we have two portals. So we have those programs. Our GIS program is also enterprised into a central system. So while we do have a very federated environment, generally speaking, there have been success stories where we've been able to centralize some of that information. The reason I say that is that's going to step into this next slide where we're talking about some of the initiatives, the initiatives we've been looking to accomplish. Some of these have already been completed or are in flight or will be coming down the line. But we've bucketed these into a number of different areas. One of them is organization, where we really want to talk about our general, what's our plan? So we've already put together our strategic plan for the state, but let's start to build foundationally how we want to organize and structure our information, how we're going to document that to ensure that we have sustainability over time. It's great to put together a plan, but if you don't have actual objectives and approach and ways to validate you're doing what you said you're going to do, the plan really means nothing. So that's one of the areas we're focusing on. Another is people and culture. So what's critical, and we heard literacy a couple of times in the earlier presentations, but being in that position where we can start to not just standardize how we are understanding, talking about, and the terms we're using when we're working in the data world, especially within the government space. We also want to be in a position where we're training and building up that level of maturity across the state. In many cases, we're kind of forced into situations when an employee is hired, they just start just working with existing processes because that's what they've been told to do, but don't understand why it's important. What's the value? How do we tell effective stories with data to ensure that there's a firm understanding of why we're doing it? The third area we're going to focus on is collaboration. And that's really our data sharing agreements. And I'm not going to go into too much on that today because it's monotonous, but the idea is that we struggle with sharing data. And there's got to be a more effective way to do this. That's both within state government and with external partners. So one of our major initiatives is centralizing that and building more of a trust factor that allows us to have access to the data when we need it and use it the way we need it in a timely manner. And then the third is innovation, looking at the way that we're leveraging analytics across the state. What technologies are we beginning to use? Where we do have some data science programs, what's in place? How are we establishing, leveraging some of the models that are being placed? How are those being maintained? How are we sharing stories about those? But before we get into any of these initiatives, we really have to start with a foundation. And that foundation is going to be data governance, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. So when we're talking about data governance within the state, we're looking at this more, as I mentioned, with our federated environment as the rules of the road. And what I mean by that is the way we're framing this with all of our agencies and the executive resources that are out there that want to know what we're doing is we're coming to an agreement on common practices. We're going to take a drive, and we're agreeing to take 95 North. We know on 95 North there are going to be speed limits posted. We know there are going to be green signs showing us what the upcoming exits are, what our mile markers are. We've got guardrails, we've got medians, we've got striped lines telling us what lanes to stay in, and we've got rest stops along the way, right? But I may take an 18-wheeler, Justin may take an SUV, someone else may ride share, take an Uber or a Lyft, or have a contractor come in and help them to get there. We're going to do things in different ways. We'll have multiple rest stops. The speed limit, the speeds with which we drive may be different, but ultimately we're agreeing on those common principles that we're driving north on 95 and that we know what the general rules of the roads are. And then we'll fit our strategy of how we're going to get there to comply with the rules of the road. So where did we start to kind of get the trip started, if you will, right? Well, we had to kind of define certain characteristics to make sure that the stories we're telling are clear, our mission is clear, and that it's relatable. So we started with the question of, why are we doing this? Well, in order to do it, we need to establish clear, concise, a vision, mission, and principle that everyone can agree upon and understand what the ultimate goals are going to be. We have to understand, what do we have, right? We have to put together a data inventory. What do we mean by any of this? So we have to establish a standardized data terminology and glossary. And then how do we do it? That's the framework we're establishing, or we've established to date, that we, essentially those are the rules of the road that we're going to follow. So the first thing we established was very high level, very simple, a vision and mission, just to use trustworthy, reliable data to maximize the delivery of government services. Really simple. And our mission is to empower the state of Maryland with trusted data that's easy to use, understand, and is integrated in services across agencies and coordinated offices in the executive branch. So one of the things I do want to call out as part of this mission is our office is limited to the executive branch of state government. So we don't have legislative or judiciary responsibility. We are working to build relationships. Well, we've built the relationships. We're working to have them participate in much of what we're doing, but there's nothing that legally is requiring them to do that. So in addition to those, the vision and the mission, we have 4 core principles. Data must be treated as a strategic asset. I understand people always talk about people are our most important asset, our most important asset. Well, people leave companies, organizations, and government sectors all the time. But the data is always going to be there, and we have to start to really value that as a strategic asset, something that has monetary value and something that needs to be treated as such. Data strategies must align with the business strategies of our organization. We cannot have a one-size-fits-all, or we can't start to implement processes that don't actually align with what we want to do as a business or organization. Data must be managed consistently. This gets back to the idea I said before, where we can't just have a plan. We also have to have ways to validate we're doing what we said we're going to do. And that data management roles must be defined. We've got to ensure that we have people in the right positions to effectively manage the data to ensure that it's sustainable, trustworthy, timely, and accurate. So that was the first thing we had to baseline off of. The next step we took was establishing a data inventory. So I'm not sure how many people within the room have gone through the process of establishing a data inventory. I mentioned I started so November 17th was my first day. Part of the executive order that created the position in the office also requires, on an annual basis, a data inventory be compiled for the entire state, which included that past year. So we had 1 month to complete a statewide data inventory. So our approach to this had to we had to work with what we had. So it was, we're going to rely on institutional knowledge. Every agency, everyone had the same template. Every agency had to fill out certain business information about the data itself. I've got a listing of kind of the things that we populated here at the bottom. But every agency had to fill out their own. It becomes a living, breathing document that they're constantly updating, and then we just ETL that up into a centralized, consolidated version that gives us the statewide inventory. Now, within a month, I think we did an awesome job, but do we have 5%, 10%? We don't know, because we haven't had the standard governance practices in place to really ensure that we know what we have, when we have, and where we have it. So we're going to constantly evolve through identifying what data that we do have. And that's going to be assisted by implementation of data catalogs. So we are going through the process of combining the institutional knowledge manual approach with the automated crawling approach of a data catalog, and building more of a real-time data discovery environment between those two, where we're taking business information, we're taking operational and metadata information, and marrying those two to try to provide the most valuable, discoverable environment we possibly can. Now, that's going to take some time to get there, but it's something we're in the process of implementing right now. But without knowing what we have, we can't really do anything super fun or exciting or leverage the technologies that we need to. Additionally, the inventory allows us to understand duplication, which we have a tremendous amount of duplication. Unfortunately, duplication tends to be out of convenience. So what I mean by that is, I talked about the data sharing agreements before. 2 agencies will want to, hey, I've got a problem, I need to get access to your data. Great, we're going to get the lawyers, the AAGs now are involved, or our Attorney General's office involved between the two to establish our data sharing agreements. We'll see you in 6 months. Well, that's a pain. I'll just go ahead and create my own version of this data because it's more convenient. I can get to what I need to. But now we've lost that authoritative single source of truth. Now we've got two versions of similar data that don't directly align, and that's a problem. So this allows us to identify where some of those are, and then in turn be able to take a step back and say, okay, who's required to capture this data, and then how do we build a more appropriate connection between agencies to ensure that everyone's using that official source. So our catalog also will allow us to further enforce our governance and policy as well. So that's the added benefit of having that bridge that we're talking about. So the next thing we talked about, or we implemented, was a standardized data terminology and glossary. And there were three key issues that we wanted to make sure we handle with this. There had to be standard definitions that were industry standard as well. We're not trying to have unique, we're special, we have our own definition for this term. It has to be easily available to everyone. And then we've got to continually review and update that. It's not a static document. It's going to change all the time. So my very first day, I had a conversation with an agency how they were implementing a data lake. I was like, oh, that's interesting. What are you using? And they said, oh, well, we're using SQL Server to do that, and that's going to be our data lake. I was like, oh, that's an interesting approach. What exactly, why are you implementing a data lake and you're just leveraging an existing database you have, and what are your goals? They had a consultant come in and tell them that they would be most successful to have a data lake, so they're now just referring to an existing database they had as a data lake. I was like, well, that's not a data lake. It's like eating an apple and telling someone, well, I'm eating an orange. They're like, no, it's an apple. We can't have those types of conversations. That gets back to that literacy statement I said before. We have to have everyone speaking the same terms. And if they don't know what something is, having something to refer back to say that this is what we're defining as a data lake, or any other term that's out there. So it's a constant evolving list. We make it available from our open data portal, and then also I'm hoping that it'll be done by, it was supposed to be done by the end of May. I'm hoping it'll be done by mid-June. We're going to have a Office of the Chief Data Officer website that will have direct access to the exact same list, and it's going to be the consolidated environment for our data governance framework, our strategic plan, our terminology, our data literacy program, all of that. So, and that'll be open to anyone who wants, it's open to the public. So you can go and take whatever you'd like from that and reuse it as much as you'd like. So following the terminology and glossary as our second step in this, or third step in this process, we had to establish our data governance framework. And our framework is really going to be 6 primary areas that we're focusing on. As I mentioned, we've got agencies with different levels of maturity. Some incredibly mature with the resources in place to be incredibly successful. They already have got their documentation in place. I had a meeting on Thursday with one organization that presented their strategy to us, and it was exactly what we were looking for, and it had been developed 8 months ago, well before I started. It was awesome. So in many cases, we're not asking people to go back and start from scratch. We just want them to hit on 6 core principles. We need to define what our organization and our structure is going to look like. Who are the people responsible for the data? What is their overall role in the organization? What authority do they have? What governance structure do you have in place? Executive steering, data governance council, your data steward coordinators, your data stewards, kind of your going from the operational and tactical up to your strategic approach. We need to define that, and we need to document it and maintain that. What is the overall strategy? So because these agencies have different missions, we need to understand what, from a data standpoint, they want to put together as their strategy. The third it says policy, standards, and procedures, but it's standards and procedures. At the statewide level, we're establishing policies, but our policies are very generalized. And the idea behind it is, if we can establish a generalized policy, the agency can take that and ensure that they're meeting their mission with the standards they have to put in place because they receive federal funding, or they have certain state requirements that they have to meet. So an example of that would be a policy that states all data needs to have comprehensive metadata associated with it. That's the policy. It's simple. Or all quality control plans need to be identified for each of your data sets, or established for each of your data sets. That's it. And then they can then establish what those approaches are. The fourth is our CID, is our continuous improvement data governance. That's really our monitoring and reporting. That's how we're looking at, are we doing what we said we're going to do? What's the approach we're going to take? How are we going to continue to assess and evaluate? Our third is the technology. And this is really a challenge, and I'm curious to see what Justin explain, if he covers any of this at all. We have a very disparate technology stack across the state. We do not have a lot of consistency when it comes to all the agencies using a particular environment. We have two very large AWS environments that some agencies are in one, some agencies are in the other, and we're just now working to get them consolidated into a single environment. We've got agencies that are leveraging Azure. We've got agencies that are leveraging Google Cloud Platform. We've got agencies that are looking at Snowflake. We've got agencies that are looking at other technologies like that, and there's not a lot of consistency across the board. That's not a huge problem, but it can be a big problem if we don't establish the right approach, the right framework to ensure that we can interact with each other. And what we want to do as part of these overall governance frameworks is the agencies need to identify what they're using, not what they want to use. What are we using today? Because we've got a lot of legacy environments. We still love access, love it, throughout the state, which is terrifying. And so we have to have some modernization effort that's going to look at what are we going to do with a lot of these existing data environments as we migrate them, modernize them in the future. What do we want to use? But before we know what we want to use, we need to know what we have today. So that's part of what our framework also involves. And then the sixth is what I would consider perhaps the most important, and that's communication. Everyone in this room is super excited about data, right? It's not necessarily a shared enthusiasm in other parts of government, right? So I spent the first 2 months as the governance guy is going to come in and annoy us because everyone wants sexy things. They're like, what kind of models can we develop? We can't develop models if we don't know where our data is. We don't know what the quality of our data is. We don't have the foundation, the frameworks established in advance. So having effective communication plans around why we're doing this, how we're going to communicate with our agencies, how we're going to keep them updated, how we're going to tell effective stories so that they don't need to know who cares, if you're someone making a decision, do you care that the underlying data is a JSON file? No, not at all. You want to understand what the outcome is and understand that we had collected data as part of the responsibility of our agency, and it resulted in you making this policy decision. We have to get to that end of the story. So the communication part is really critical. Everything tied in our entire framework has to keep security and privacy in consideration. So in addition to my position, we also created the statewide chief privacy officer. And one of the things that I think was really, really important, and it's going to go into the next page, and I will wrap up here in a second, is organization. And I mentioned the chief privacy officer. In addition to our statewide positions, the executive orders for both of our positions also requires each agency to create an agency data officer and an agency privacy officer. And the reason that's super important is it gives us single point of contact, direct liaison with each agency, and then they are put in a position of having a certain sense or amount of authority when it comes to relaying information both from what we're trying to establish at a statewide level, but then also bring information back up from the agencies. In the government space, there tends to be I'll wait you out type of vibe if there are certain timelines in place. And what we're trying to do is build more of a culture where with these agency data officers, we can more effectively communicate at the agency level and get to the right people with the right message. Where if you're just relying on a single point of contact, in this case me, to try to communicate with everyone, we're going to fail. It's not going to be effective. So having those positions in place really allows us to start building out that communication line, but then also gives us the right organizational structure to be effective in the way that we kind of share and distribute information both down to the agencies and back up to our office. So the last part of this that I want to talk about is inside of the framework. We talked about the organization, and what we want that to be is the agency's own version of what we're establishing as a statewide standpoint. So when we're talking about putting together data governance practices, best practices, the frameworks, it's not something that we can come up with just me or one other person. We need to have input from a variety of people, and if we've established this organization, this is nothing earth-shattering. This is pretty standard what you're going to see in any type of book or document out there. We want to make sure that we are effectively working with those agencies to make these decisions, getting that buy-in from them so that there is active participation. There's a sense of ownership from the agencies as well. It isn't something that they're being mandated to do, but in fact they're participating in. So we're establishing this statewide structure where we have, our standardized core governance council or the steering committee, but then really the governance council that's putting together the framework content and what's the most important components of these. And that really is the agency data officers who are working with us on that in that particular level. So they have that sense of each agency's got buy-in, a voice, and an ability to make change or affect change in the different policies that we're putting in place. So that's the way that we're trying to kind of really focus on bridging communication and organization within our general structure. So the last thing I wanted to just talk about is that's the foundation building. That's what we've done so far in the last 6 months. We've got a couple of other things running in parallel that I find really exciting. You may not all find really exciting. So we're also running through a data management maturity assessment right now. The idea is let's get a standardized baseline for all these agencies and then develop a roadmap to help them improve the way they're operating. Our innovation assessment. So in my before I came back to the state, I worked I worked at a mid-sized engineering company building up a data services team, and a coworker had sold off a number of ML companies over the course of the last 25, 30 years. He'd started it in the 80s out of UVA and had gradually built up a number of companies and sold them off. But his group was called the Emerging Technologies Group and used to drive him nuts because he's like, I've emerged, right? It's machine lab. I've been doing this for 30 years. I'm no longer emerging. So he's like, he burnt into my brain that we'll call it innovative technologies instead of emerging technologies. And what we're doing is essentially assessing every agency's current state. What are you using? How are you using? What resources you have? And what do you think innovative technologies are? Is a business intelligence app what you're defining as you have, a completely advanced program? Or are you using, do you have ML models that you're maintaining on a regular basis and using to predict everything that you're doing? Just trying to get that assessment so that we can then better understand where are our centers of excellence, where do we have our strength, and how do we start to kind of collaborate with others who want to build programs similar to be successful. And then the last thing is our data literacy program development. We're putting together 3 courses right now around data management. The first one we're hoping is going to wind up being mandated for as part of the onboarding process. You get hired by the state. It's pretty impressive, right? Really impressive. Mandated by the state so that if you get hired, you have to take that. And the idea is to at least, day one on the job, you have to understand why data is important to the state. And with that, I went, yeah, good timing. I'm done. So there you go.
Cool. Thanks, Pat. I hope I wasn't distracting you with all my head nodding, but maybe they're pulling up the other slide deck. Aha. Okay. Cool. So thanks, everybody. This is my first time actually exploring the UMBC campus at all, really, and this auditorium is gorgeous. So thanks to Jason and Erica for putting this together and to UMBC. I was joking to Pat backstage that, while you've been learning about AI and machine learning, I'm going to talk to you about documents and lists for a little bit before lunch. My name's Justin Elszasz. I'm Baltimore's Chief Data Officer. Similar to Pat, I'm going to start with a little bit about the role because that is kind of important as we get into data governance. We're responsible for it. So determining exactly what kind of authority we have and what kind of problems we're here to solve is really important. My role it's basically a year old. So the city has had a chief data officer for, I don't know, maybe 10 years. Previously, our chief data officer sat in our IT agency, information and technology over there. So what's changed is when I took the role, the role was moved out of the IT agency and into the mayor's office. So I report directly to our city administrator, which also happened to be a new role at the time. That's important because it implies different things about what we're able to do, different authority, that kind of thing. So, and similar to what Pat was describing, and this is how I describe city government or any government really to anyone who isn't familiar with working in the public sector, but we're an organization of organizations. So when we talk about things like data sharing and problem solving, you hear a lot about working in silos and not being able to share data. This is why, is because in some respects, yeah, the city of Baltimore is one government. In other respects, each of these agencies is treated independently, has its own rules and laws governing it, and even rules of engagement with other agencies themselves. So just want to acknowledge it, like that's kind of really important to the work in government and how we set up data governance. So along that vein, I want you to imagine, you've got Elon Musk type money and you decide to buy a few different companies, all doing different things, right? So making newspapers, building cars, making burritos. Imagine you buy those 3 companies and appoint yourself chief data officer. That's a lot like being the chief data officer for city government. We have all these government agencies that are doing completely different things. Our health department has entirely different laws and workflows and processes separate from our public works department or our police department. But there are a lot of common problems that I've experienced. I started off as a data scientist in city government for our innovation team a number of years ago. And even prior to that, was consulting to the federal government. This is something that shows up, I am certain this shows up in every organization. Maybe it is more so in city and state governments. But some form of this problem surfaces almost on a weekly basis when you're a chief data officer. You get an email or a call that is basically some form of this problem, right? So one agency is asking, hey, do you know who has X data? I would love if they could share it because I want to do this, that, and the other thing with it. So the way we go about finding that data, or if I happen to know who has that data, what typically happens is there's this loop that happens where you go to the agency and say, hey, can you share this data? And they say, you're going to have to be more specific because we have lots of data about that. Can you be more specific? And the requester says, well, I don't know how to be more specific because I don't know exactly what you have. So you end up in this horrible loop. It takes long email chains and a lot of time to establish what exactly someone is trying to solve, or what data people are actually looking for. And by the time you actually solve that problem, the data they get, maybe that problem has lost its urgency, maybe that problem has lost its importance. Maybe the data have gone stale by then because you can't actually get them a data pipeline. All you can really do is share a static file. So this is a pretty common problem. There are a number of other common problems too, right? These are various formats that our residents encounter when trying to access government data. So yes, we have Open Baltimore. That's our online open data platform. But there are still a number of examples where agencies post their own data, their own dashboards, whatever it is. And so you end up with all these different formats that residents are experiencing data through. If you look in this upper left-hand corner, maybe a lot of you have heard about the tax sale process in the city of Baltimore. Actually, it's a state process. It used to be that we would put out a list of these properties that are going up for tax sale once a year in a PDF. And by law, it has to be published in a newspaper of record. And so that PDF is actually from the Daily Record. So that's one form. You've got a couple of different types of portals to access data from. Down here is a snapshot of a PDF of, it's called the police department calls it the X-Sum report, but it's basically a weekly crime statistics report. I think that PDF is something like 20 or 30 pages long. If we don't post that on time every week, I typically get an email from Justin Fenton, the reporter at the Baltimore Sun, asking why we haven't posted that yet. So it's a really good signal, in fact, that even though this is a PDF, there's really useful information in there. So I can't just stop putting this PDF online. I have to keep doing it because we know, at the very least, Justin Fenton, our crime reporter, is looking at it. We have too many sources of truth. And we often have to ask ourselves the question of where a certain number came from. This is just one example. We have this, I call this our work order trifecta. Our 3-in-1 platform, so if you have the 3-in-1 app or call 3-in-1 in the City of Baltimore, the platform we're using to operate that is an instance of Salesforce. But we also have these other work order systems that other agencies have stood up. So our Department of Transportation and our Department of Public Works use CityWorks for certain workflows and certain types of work orders. CHIP, I don't remember what it stands for, is a homegrown system at our housing department that was, like I said, was homegrown by one individual at the housing department over the course of 15, 20 years. These things need to talk to each other because each of the agencies wants to continue using their work order system because that's what they're used to. We want 3-in-1 to reflect the work that's being done by the agencies so that residents have an accurate picture of the work being done and that they can see their work showing up and they have a tangible proof that their requests are being taken care of. But it means we end up in these like dangerous territory where an outcome budget metric for Department of Public Works might come out of 3-in-1 or service requests, but our week-to-week daily management of the agencies and their performance management or CitiStat, looking at the data, might be using one of the work order systems because it has certain other fields or other characteristics of those workflows. Another one that we've encountered a lot is that our vendor doesn't, we shouldn't blame the vendors. We haven't done the work in our contracts of ensuring that we have the proper data access and controls. We end up kind of going back to vendors and asking and begging for data because, over the course of the last even 5 years or so, we've hired a lot of data analysts into city government. We're ready and hungry for taking advantage of our data more. I get this type of question all the time from data analysts in the city. One of them is here in the audience, probably nodding his head vigorously. I get this kind of question all the time. Again, because we've got the expertise in-house now to be able to take advantage of more data, but our contracts haven't provided a mechanism for doing that. And so we end up not being able to kind of take advantage of the data that even we are generating or creating. All right, so given that those are some of the problems in data governance, like think back to being, having purchased Chipotle and Subaru and Baltimore Sun. Thinking about being the chief data officer for that kind of global corp that has to rule them all. These are some of the constraints or the bounds around the role. So you can't ask, you can ask your subsidiaries, but you can't necessarily tell them what to do. So Pat was describing this as well, that we don't always have the authority to just walk into an agency and say, you have to do things this way. And so that implies certain things about how you share data between agencies and how you go about solving these problems, really. You can facilitate information exchange, but you can't necessarily share the information yourself. So those agencies, like I said, in some instances, we're treated as City of Baltimore at large. In a lot of other instances, we need to treat agencies, they are independent agencies. Those independent agencies, they are the owners of the data. And so I may want two agencies to share data because I think it's going to solve a particular problem or because a data analyst in one of the agencies is asking for it. I can't force that to happen, and I can't just take the data out of a database and hand it over to the other agency. Those agencies own their own data and have to be empowered and smart enough to make good decisions about when to share that data. I can't hire any staff right now. I'm an office of one, so that's a pretty limiting factor. And I don't have a budget. Our budget hearings have been this week. I'm sure none of you actually watched the budget hearings, but the one for our IT agency, I get invited to basically be present at one of the budget hearings. But my part of it was the last 5 minutes offering up to City Council that I don't have a slide because I don't have a budget, but I'm here to answer any questions if you have any. So how do you go about solving some of those problems that I described given these constraints and given that there are so many different workflows and agencies are doing so many different things on different systems like Pat described? These are some of the tactics that have been useful to me. Like I said, we spent the morning discussing AI and machine learning, and now I'm going to tell you about writing things down and making lists. Write stuff down. So our publication process for Open Baltimore, it used to fly around in emails. It wasn't very clear. So it didn't really engage our agencies and give them a good understanding of how to get things published. We certainly did get things published, but it was usually knowing the right person and one person in an agency emailing IT and saying, hey, is this something we can put on Open Baltimore? And there being a round of emails between themselves and then eventually the law department. The process was never really written down so that everyone kind of understood what needed to be done. So again, being an office of one, knowing that I don't have the authority to go and make anyone else do anything, that was one of the first tasks I took on was just let's write down this process so everyone has a clear understanding of what it is. Same with this data quality toolkit over the last few months. So part of data governance, and I think Pat was describing this a bit on his slide that kind of showed you the pyramid structure of governance. We have at least one data steward in every agency who's responsible for implementing data governance in their agency. The idea that's first, and at the end of last year, we did kind of a quick voting process to decide what we wanted to focus on. These data stewards, this is an unfunded mandate to stand up this data governance effort over the last year. And our data stewards are having to carve out a couple of hours every month to devote to this kind of thing. At the end of last year, we did a quick voting process on where we wanted to focus our attention, and the thing that came to the top was data quality. So over the course of now, that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different folks, and I think for a lot of our data stewards who may or may not be data analysts, they might be IT folks, they might be business process owners, it's a pretty nebulous topic. Yeah, we know that this field is free text entry and the categories don't make sense, but how do I even go about fixing that? So we wrote up a data quality toolkit earlier in this year that lays out step by step, even if it's just selecting one particular field. We don't need to fix data quality for all our data sets or even an entire data set, but pick one field and solve one problem within that field. And we wrote up a data quality toolkit to help them through that process. Another thing is by far, the most common question I get from residents about open data is, I don't understand what this data means, I don't understand what this value means, or how to interpret this field. We now have requirements, and this goes back to documenting our open publication or our open data publication process. We now have kind of hard and fast requirements that we're not going to publish anything unless it has metadata and a data dictionary. And we're now going through a process of our data stewards capturing that metadata for data sets that already exist. Create lists. This comes back to the data inventory. It's exactly what it sounds like. I don't know if anyone's had any particular fun creating the data inventory in the city and city government, but I can say that it's already had. We see this as kind of an enabling piece of work. Obviously, it's going to aid in things like data discoverability. So when I talked about that problem of long email chains, even to decipher what data is being asked for, or defining, okay, we have a lot of data about, this particular topic. What exactly are you looking for? Having the data inventory will help people in agencies say, that's the data I want. or I didn't even know we captured that data. That's going to help me solve this problem if I can get my hands on it. I also mentioned the problem of not knowing where numbers come from. With several of the mayor's offices, there are a number of mayor's offices that collect some kind of performance data or metrics about our agencies. Our budget office collects performance measures. We have CitiStat that does performance management. We now have recovery office. Jason Howard's here from the recovery office. They collect performance metrics for every program and project that we're going to be funding with ARPA, federal grant dollars from recovering from COVID. So we started building out an inventory of these metrics so that we can define them and find out what use cases they have and find out where we have overlap, because chances are each of these offices is asking for a similar but separate metric on a lot of different topics, and it creates a lot of burden for agencies to do that reporting, especially when each office might essentially be asking for the same thing. Pat also mentioned communication. A lot of what I've shown you is we've made publicly available on our Open Baltimore, our open data website. We've basically tried to expand our open data portal to include things beyond just raw data. Obviously, things like dashboards and tools to help people interpret the data, but also a blog and all of these different documents and policies and templates that we've been developing to help our data stewards in data governance. Fix stuff once. This is kind of another principle that's been helpful and another tactic. I mentioned the problem of agencies not being able to access the data from a vendor. This is a common problem that's come up in multiple agencies. And instead of fixing it on a contract by contract basis and hoping that we get it right, or hoping that the language ends up giving them the access that we need, we drafted up basically some boilerplate contract language that agencies can use when creating new IT contracts, so that we can ensure that it's at least a starting point. Vendors are always going to come back with their stipulations as well. But it's a starting point for giving us better ownership and better access to our data. So those are kind of the three kind of tactics that I've found really helpful in data governance. Like I said, this has been about making documents and lists because, as Pat described, our agencies do such vastly different work that you have to find the lowest common denominator and solve the problems that they actually are experiencing. And so these are the things that have come in handy for me. I'm happy to talk through a little bit more about vision and analytics in the city, but wanted to leave you with just kind of a couple of the tools that have been help us been successful in data governance. So I'll stop there. We have a few minutes left for questions, but thank you. Any questions, comments?
Thank you both so much for sharing all of that. I think a lot of us may be in a similar position. But my question is, I understand, and thank you again for all the data governance background and instructions. And my question has to do with data collection. With all the data that we have, there's always going to be data, for whether it's from the state or the city that's missing. And Justin, I work at Baltimore Development Corporation. I've talked to you through Zoom. Hi. Just like one example is vacant commercial buildings in Baltimore City. And I guess just my question is, as part of the data governance, is there a plan in the future to have some kind of process in place to collect data that we actually don't collect? Out of all the data we do collect, is there a plan for missing gaps in data, some kind of process that's going to be in place at some point?
Yeah, great question. For governments, we kind of have an imperative to only collect data that we need and not collect data that we don't need. This is for obviously privacy and ethics concerns, but also just not being in a position to manage data that we aren't going to use. So we are not like Facebook and Google, where we're going to eat up every data point that we possibly can, just in the hopes of it providing some kind of useful information later on. We just can't do that. So when it comes to data collection, it's very much driven by what the need is. If there's a need to solve a problem, then we go and get that data. So on something like commercial vacant properties, we will go get that data if that's a particular problem that our city agencies have. We'll find a way of collecting it. Obviously, a lot of our data is more administrative in nature. So think of things like permits or work orders and service requests, some kind of transaction that has happened between government and a resident. A lot of our data is of that nature. And so when it comes to collecting, either data that's kind of semi-static or is environmental in nature, we have to come up with put a project around it unto itself, because it's not administrative data that just happens to come out of some other work stream or workflow. But that said, I mean, like I said, when a problem demands it, if it's something we need to solve a problem, we can find a way, given the constraints of, staff bandwidth, budget, and how it fits into priorities. But given all that, that's kind of what we're here for. Pat, I don't know if you had anything to add. But
I would echo it. Our approach, particularly on the open side, is we've got, through our Open Data Portal, the ability to submit requests for data. Interestingly enough, and this becomes more of a communication and messaging challenge that we need to continue to work toward, sometimes those requests are actually for data that's already available. But the terms that are being used, the keywords they're using to search for the data aren't hitting. So it allows us to kind of reinforce some of that. But yeah, if there is data that is missing that is justified by the agencies responsible to make it available, we'll do our best to do that. But I think the use case has to be appropriate, and it has to warrant the resources continuing to maintain making that data available in order to kind of move forward on it.
Can I just open by saying the spaghetti diagram of making a data request? That's my life. So thank you for that. I took a photograph of that. It's going to get used at work. I want to ask you specifically about data discoverability. I mean, you both talked about the importance of having data inventories and knowing what data is there. But I very quickly, whenever I go and look at government stuff, I'm overwhelmed by the number of sources of data, and finding the thing that I want becomes very difficult. And do you guys have thoughts on how to make that easier for people?
So part of it, I think there's two sides of it. One is ensuring on the discovery side. So we hear data catalogs a lot and data inventory, and the reason, at least in the state, we're trying to leverage more of the discovery environment is because we want it to be a little bit more robust, a little bit more real time. Because that's one of the real challenges of inventories and catalogs is if you're not actively maintaining those, it can get stale very, very quickly. So trying to be in a position where we're constantly curating it allows us to hopefully be in a position where we're distilling some of the information more effectively so that you're not in kind of an alphabet soup environment. The other side of that actually goes back to the point I made before is continuing to reinforce keyword and the tags that are being used, because I think that tends to be a challenge that can be more easily overcome if we put the effort in to ensure that we're accounting for where those gaps exist. Because if you're going in and saying, you have all this data, or I know there's the data there, but I can't find what I'm looking for. Is that because the data doesn't exist, or is it because the terminology you're looking for is common, yet we haven't included it yet, right? So it has to be that constant review, which can be a challenge. And I think there are also, it's not something we've done at all on the open data side, but I do think that ability to, not necessarily a public audit, but the request mechanism to say, these are the things we're looking for, less from the perspective of, here are the data sets we want to see, more of, these are the types of concepts and terms I'm interested in, and then ensuring that we're hitting on those with the data that we're making available to hopefully make it more more easily found for you. So.
Yeah, I also think, like I mentioned, we're having to go back and collect metadata and data dictionaries for our open data platform, because it's just the most common question we get is how to interpret the data. But one thing I was going to say is I also think part of, and this goes for any organization, but data analysts are often, especially in resource-strapped places like city government, you probably have kind of a centralized data team that is pretty far away from a lot of the work being done. And unless those data people like myself or data analysts in city government are actually going and doing ride-alongs with those public works crews or a ride-along in a squad car with the police department, it's not that we don't know the workflows and those business processes well enough to describe them and be able to answer questions about what the data even mean. And so, and not only that, but if we turn around and try to find that, supervisor of the crews to help answer the questions, they're busy trying to do their job. So, having to answer questions for, on a one-off ad hoc basis for residents about what a particular field means, that's why we need the metadata, is because it often results in me going to the agency head, who then puts me in contact with a deputy director, who then puts me in contact with some supervisor who's just trying to get through their day, and I'm hounding them with questions about what certain data means. So it's all the more reason to, and again, like Pat said, for a lot of these manual data inventories that we're having to do, because we can't just scrape all of our databases for the right information. It's manual, it's gonna be out of date pretty quickly. So we really have to empower and make sure our data stewards have the time to be doing that work, because we know it's of value, and the data are essentially worthless if we don't have that information.
Hi guys. First of all, thank you for your service, Justin, for the City of Baltimore, and Patrick, for all the Marylanders in the room. My question to you is looking to the near or even far future. What are some specific quantifiable metrics that would indicate that there's been progress made? Right. I understand that government is not like business, right? In business, whenever you put out a product, you have to quantify it, observe the metrics. That gives you a sense that there's progress. What are some of the things, metrics, or if it's not quantifiable, what are some of the things that are clear indications that you're making progress? Yeah.
So I have qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative, the way that we're measuring it is if people can repeat what we're doing. So if we're having conversations with different agencies and the message we're sharing is one that they've heard before, because we're effectively communicating it, they understand why we're doing these things, that's the qualitative side where you're able to understand some progress is being made. On the quantitative side, from our perspective, we're really looking at filling gaps, right? So when we look at quality assessments and we may have certain measures that show up red or light shades of red because of gaps that are there, if we can get those to yellow in a short time period, we know we're not gonna have massive change like that, but we wanna see incremental change as we go. So if we can see, and the other thing that quantity is not necessarily as important to us as quality. So if we look at our open data, for example, we want to ensure as part of our data freshness report that we put out that data is being updated when it should be, that the metadata information is not missing at all, that the certain standards that we're applying so that our dashboard that we make publicly available doesn't have reds, doesn't have no's, doesn't, and that's the way that I think we quantify improvement, because it's going to be buy-in by culture, right? So we can force people hey, you have to look at this every month, and someone can just easily say, yep, did it, done, instead of investing the time to make sure it's right. So if we can start to look at some of those, those gaps that are closing, I think that's going to give us a sense that we're starting to make progress from the buy-in and from the culture standpoint, that it's important to actually spend the time to make sure the data is right, it's timely, it's accurate, and it's ready to be consumed.
Yeah, yes to everything Pat said. I also think of, anytime I hear the word outcomes, I think of outcomes for the city, not just for data governance, right? And in fact, let's see if I can pull it up. Maybe not. I think I had our mission statement. We also have a mission statement for data governance in the city. And we made it it was really important that we included language around solving problems for residents and how data governance eventually ties up to, keeping our parks and our streets cleaner, reducing the violent crime rates. How does better quality data and better metadata about those data, how do those core data governance concepts really contribute to the lives of our residents and their quality of life? I know it can become a little bit abstract, but as Mr. Bourne was, something he said was also about, what was it? What was the quote? It's escaping me now. Yeah, if you want to build a ship, don't just tell people to go buy the wood, show them the sea. That's part of what we're after. And so to that end, the better we can measure outcomes that we care about for the city, the better data governance must be in order for us to even get there. We have plenty of areas where we don't have great proxies for how clean something is. All we do is measure the number of work orders we complete. Not a great proxy for exactly how clean the streets are. So do we need better quality data? Do we need to collect different data? All of these are data governance questions that contribute to our perception and our measurement around the quality of life for our residents. So,
thank you. Mm-hmm.
Hey, Justin. Hey, Pat. Thanks a lot. Two quick questions. First one is, you mentioned kind of the cultural challenge of it's kind of a thankless job and you're kind of relying on folks locally within your different organizations you're interacting with to kind of be the stewards. What I found to be the challenge is they're only as good as the rate at which you educate them, so that they can also, do that job locally. I guess my question is, absent that manual labor, what have you guys found to be the best technical skill sets that they can, coming out of college, courses they did, any of that kind of stuff, or experiential skill sets that help them do that job a lot better, where it's not just a product of how much effort you guys put in? That's the first one. And then the second one is, what about, it's great when you are dealing with very highly structured data. What we're finding is just we have a lot of unstructured data. So how, we didn't talk much about that. How do you guys deal with those data sets? Those are two questions, sorry.
Maybe I'll take, the first one, because we were actually just, we were talking about this a little bit backstage that, and I'm sure a lot of you fall into this camp, but a lot of the data science programs right now, whether it's the online camps, whether you're in school for it, are focused on the model building, right? And that's the fun part. I think a lot of professors probably try to hand you some dirtier data sets, because everyone also acknowledges that 80% of data science work is cleaning data. So if you don't know how to clean data, don't know how to wrangle data, that's a really important one. But yeah, as far as data governance goes, there's no real, I don't know about Pat, but when I came into this role, I know enough about data governance to make me dangerous and know that the city needed to do it better. But I started reading up on it and read all kinds of books. But even then, I was left wanting. And the reason I put the talk together that I did today and have made similar talks in the past about is that it still felt like a bit of a mystery to me. Whereas when you show people, oh, right, that's just a list of stuff that people can enter into a template. It started to demystify it a bit for me. But those things are with any college education, you're going to get some of that. It's not about specialized knowledge necessarily. I think it's more about understanding the problems and why it's important and being an advocate for it. If you could come out of a program and not just know how to model and wrangle data, but be an advocate for solving the right problems, improving data quality, those to me are kind of what would set someone apart, I think. But
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think similarly, my background is in GIS, so we were always focused on the metadata components and making sure we had certain practices in place, but never to the extent now. And really, it wasn't until I started getting engaged in open data and asking some of those questions that I got more focused on the governance side of things. So similar to Justin, we're a large team of one in the office of the chief data officer. However, we do have I had an intern all spring and this summer from UMBC who is a data science student, but actually has been focusing more on the governance aspect within our office. And a lot of it when he first started was, here's a digital copy of the Dama Dimbach. We're going to work our way through as we use real world cases. So when we're looking at a problem, like we're developing this framework right now, here's the areas that we need to focus on. And we'd kind of work through which each of those concepts would mean so that we could start to apply the principles to real world environments. But I don't know that there's much of that you're going to get in an education space where this semester we're going to spend our time with the Dimbach. I think that is, so for anyone who's not aware, so the Dama Dimbach is the data management body of knowledge. It's 900 pages of awesome information. It's a great reference. It is one way of thinking about it. It's the majority way of thinking about it, but it's one way of thinking about it. There are others. Bob Siner's non-invasive data governance is really valuable. There's a lot of resources like that give you kind of the principal factors that you want to focus on. But that, I think, is if we can bridge that technical know-how that the students or people fresh out of school, or at least who are getting engaged in the industry, with some of that business practice that you're going to get out of more of the Dimbach type of resource, where we're talking about change management, we're talking about organizational structure, things like that, and what data governance is versus what data management is, which is often intertwined, but are in fact two different things. So I think that on the unstructured side, dark data is ugly. There's a lot of it. And a lot of right now what we're looking at from the standpoint of managing it is going to be through AI and automated approaches. So looking at technologies. We're a Google Workspace state. So we rely heavily on the Google platform for much of what we do. But things like Amazon Kendra, there's a number of different ways that we can look at starting to index and better understand what unstructured data that we have out there. But it's something that, in the broad scale, we're here and starting to evolve. So.
Yeah, I forgot about the second question. I get that question a lot from we have an Office of Legislative Reference whose job it is to make sure we've documented everything we do. I mean, we're a government, so there has to be some kind of documented legal chain for just about every decision we make. And then obviously our law department, that's one of the questions that I get from them is like, all right, you're talking about digital data that's structured in table format, but what are we doing about our documents? And I don't have a great answer for them yet, but I think that's definitely something we need to start tackling. One of the primary drivers for that is actually the requirement to have retention policies around that. And again, this gets back to doing a data inventory. I can't go and create retention policies where we don't have any if I don't even know the data exists. So it's something we have not thought about yet because, it's probably better to start up your data governance practice around the structured data to keep things simple and then grow from there. Yeah. Yeah, go for it. By the way, we're the only ones keeping you from lunch.
Yeah. Sorry,
but go ahead.
This was
I think we were also nervous the data governance conversation was going to be lacking the.
Yeah.
All right, this one is for you, Patrick, and it's kind of a follow-up on the guy that asked the question on how do you track the success of pretty much everything you institute in. I know you're just 6 months into the office, but so tracking, I know you say you track in a way, but then my next thing is, so in the next year, let's say, is there a way for me to see how successful your system, not even just tracking what you've done, but the structure, like I like the way you describe the architecture that surrounds your position, the way you interact with people on the ground and all that stuff. Is there a way I can actually glean or like copy and paste what you're building in another context?
Yes. So, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, pretty much that. So I see this, I actually really enjoy how you explained it, but let's say I go to another, let's say country or another organization, I want to be able to not create things from scratch, but use some of the philosophies that kind of, are you building on? Is there a way for me to?
Yep. So we're, as I mentioned, the website that it'll be the Chief Data Office, whatever the, cdo.maryland.gov, whatever the URL is going to wind up landing on, because we've got still have conversations to land on what the final version will be. But that's where we're going to make everything. So our strategic plan, which lays out the 2-year roadmap of everything we're going to hit on, how we're going to hit on it, then our data governance framework, the organizational structure that we're trying to put in place. What I mean by we're trying to put in place is there's a difference between us working with the agencies and putting an informal structure together like I showed before. There's a much different version of that when you go to the legislation and say, we now want to put this into statute to, by law, require that this organizational structure is defined and established. We just had this over the last couple of months. The cybersecurity side of the state just created by law, structure, an organization that actually identifies the positions that have to sit on that council. Ultimately, we want to get there because that's going to support sustainability, but from an informal standpoint where the structure I showed you before, identifying who's on that, that's all going to be made available from our website. All of the, we have every month we have 2 meetings with our ADOs. One is one-on-one, so I meet with every agency on a one-on-one basis to talk about progress, things that are coming up. Then we meet collectively as a group and talk about different initiatives. That information, right now we keep that internal, but it could certainly be shared externally too, so that you can kind of understand the different perspectives that come in as we're growing a program from scratch. So our preference is to be transparent about what we're doing and make that available, because a lot of the structure that we've put together to date, our strategic plan, is relying on information we've gotten from different states, different cities that are already out there, right? That we're not trying to reinvent anything. We're trying to leverage lessons learned from other places and implement what's worked to the best that we can.
So do I just go to data.baltimorecity.com or
That's you'll find our stuff there.
That's this, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
So ours, you can go to maryland.gov, which is just the statewide website, and it'll be available. There will be a link on as of 3 days ago, it's a new website. Prior to the redesign from 3 days ago, across the top, you'd be able to go to government and get to the CDO. Now on the right-hand side, there will be government, and then there will be a link to the CDO.
Okay.
It's also maybe an opportunity to make a plug for working in government, is that I tell people one of the best benefits is not having to worry so much about proprietary information, and then you can just steal things from other cities. So a lot of the stuff that I've developed here in Baltimore, I stole from San Francisco. They have a lot of their governance documents online. I attribute it to them.
And Joy, who used to be the CDO of San Francisco, is now the CDO for California.
For the state,
and I meet with her all the time, and we used a bunch of their stuff for the statewide one.
Yeah,
so it's
exactly.
Yeah.
And especially in local, I don't know how it is with, but like for local governments, constantly calling up like different cities and asking like how they did this thing or what problems they're working on. That's one of the best features of working in city government is I can steal ideas from other organizations and they'll willingly share.
Willingly share. Yep. Yeah. Absolutely.
Anything else? Cool.
All right, cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Al.